Accepting ideas from other people is a big part of my work. As an editor, I have to listen to a lot of people while doing books. I've also worked on some community projects and documentation, which deals with an entire community of people. And I've written enough articles to run into the problems that journalists face. So in this talk, I'm going to run through some recent trends and proposals for opening up journalism through crowdsourcing. Here is a summary of the talk. We have first what kinds of crowdsourcing are taking place now, and then a thought experiment. This is kind of interesting to just think of what would happen if we got rid of journalists and used crowdsourcing. And finally, we'll go back to journalism and deal with a few ideas for helping them to use the public. Now here is the problem as it appears from the reader, or as some people like to call him, the consumer issue that we'll deal with a bit later. Where should I go each day for information? There are so many choices for where you can start your search for news that people get overloaded. They don't know where to find what they need. So journalists and their friends may already feel like I have made a faux pas. There's a problem with these slides that could get you a little bit angry. And that is, I didn't include any traditional news outlets. There's no Wall Street Journal. There's no Washington Post. These are all portals or aggregation sites. Now, that is not such a problem as you might think. It's true that people tap non-traditional news sources a lot. But if you look more closely at this, you will see that all these slides are, portals are referring to regular news sites. That is, the journals, the newspapers, even television programs, they're all there. They're just being reached from a portal instead of from the going directly to the source. However, that still creates a problem for the news sources. Their branding is hurt when people just read them from through another site. They have fewer ad hits, they have fewer subscriptions, and so forth. So this is still a problem, and a lot of sites are trying to help journalists to get back their leading position. Okay, you might not be surprised that the Atlantic magazine is concerned about journalism. You might be a bit more surprised that Google is very interested in helping journalists. I suggest you read the issue. You can look at it online or actually go to your library. Interesting thought, and get the hard copy. So Google advises news producers to use the web effectively, to get more people to come to their site, to monitor what people are doing at their site, to offer more things that seem to be of interest to them. So it's sort of like SEO for news. Here is another interesting proposal in the journalism space. It came out several months ago. It's very long, so if you can't read the whole thing, you can do a little web searching, and you can find the summary that I put up on the O'Reilly Radar site. But the idea behind this proposal from the Reynolds Foundation, Reynolds Journalism Institute, is to think of readers as personas. You make them log in when they come to a site, a journalism site. Then you track what they're doing. You show them other articles that seem to be of interest to them and of interest to related readers. So this, you might say, is even more like Google than Google. And it may seem kind of scary or distasteful to have our information being tracked and have stuff like articles and ads being pushed at us, but I really think this is inevitable. It's the only way that the journalism field will move forward, and many of the institutions are already doing things like this. I really suggest that you follow this organization, the Knight Foundation. They fund a lot of new research in this area. They're funding some of the other things that I'm going to talk about as I move quickly through these interesting projects. This is the FCC. They've gotten involved. It's quite a long article, but it's quite interesting. It talks about the pressures on journalism and what can be done about it. In addition, there are plenty of pundits in the field, lots of journals and lots of research in the area. I chose 3 books that are fairly interesting. The first 2 are by Dan Gilmore, who gave up his job as a journalist at the San Jose Mercury News, and he talks a lot about citizen journalism. The other book is by Henry Jenkins, who has written several books about what he calls participatory culture, a phrase he made famous. He talks a lot about movies and video games, which he seems to like more than serious stuff. But he talks about journalism as well. And don't flame me for that joke, please. Now, here are some recent initiatives, some individual projects I thought might be interesting. They have to do with gathering information, visualizing information, both for yourself and to help your readers visualize it, increasing your reach, hopefully to get new subscribers or just more readers, tapping public input, also known as crowdsourcing. So one of these things is Fuego. This is done by the Neiman Foundation. They use it to track what's hot on Twitter. So they're interested in finding out about the news, finding out things that people are saying about the news. It's a tool for gathering data, but it uses public input, so there's some crowdsourcing involved. And I wouldn't recommend that you bend everything you do as a journalist to what the crowd finds interesting. However, it's good for highlighting things that you might have otherwise missed. Here's a nice little clever thing. The New York Times, a while back, put out an election app. They put up their own articles, but they put up other people's articles too. That's very important. They are trying to be a source where people go first, rather than just a feeder into some other portal. So hopefully this will extend their reach. It will lead people to read more New York Times articles than they would have otherwise, and it will perhaps gain new subscriptions for them. Here's something else that extends reach. Printcasting lets you put in blogs or other web stuff and get out something in print. So this extends the reach of individuals rather than extending the reach of a major news outlet like New York Times. It lets you get to more places than you would have with just your blog. Here we have a real honey trap for news junkies. A great site that gets articles from around the world. I happened to pull it up when they had a featured article on Uganda, an article that I had not seen anywhere in any Western journalism. And I thought it was quite interesting, exposing cultural tensions in Uganda. So basically on Global Voices, you can find out what people outside the Beltway are talking about. Lots of people all around the world. Now this is an experiment in both gathering news and in crowdsourcing. The idea is you share whatever data you have and you encourage others to link to it and to add to it. And you never know what kind of correlations might turn up. This was covered by Alex Howard, a journalist who works for O'Reilly. We have another one. This is an example of visualizing data. The Associated Press is using this to try to find connections so that they can improve their own news gathering. They can find their own stories. Now, I don't think this particular one would be chosen by Edward Tufte in his gallery of great visualizations. But some New York Times visualizations might turn up here. Here's an interesting one. It shows the disparities in New Orleans, who got to return after Katrina and who didn't. It's a very interesting thing, but it really raises a lot more questions. It makes you ask what neighborhood had mostly poor people and what had mostly minorities. So who did get to come back and who didn't? What we need as we look at something like this is what's called a context layer. The context layer means extra information that helps you to interpret either text or a visualization. It's a very powerful concept. Now this is fun. Find a statement on the Internet that you disagree with. Sounds easy. However, you've got to back it up once you do that. So this, seriously, is a very worthwhile site. It attacks the well-known tendency of people to create filter bubbles. That means they read only the things with which they agree. They don't read anything that would challenge their deep-seated opinions. So sites like this also add a credibility layer to the news. We talked about a context layer. This is a credibility layer. A similar project is Truth Goggles, which started at the MIT's Media Lab. And the goal of both of these projects is similar to Clay Johnson's information diet, a thing he's been talking about for a couple of years and which O'Reilly has a book on. So this is the last project that I'll highlight. It's like printcasting, but it goes even further. It allows people to use audio like telephones and to broadcast things over radio. It's really opening up radio. And you should remember that this is not just for illiterate people, because many cultures have written languages that are not adequately represented in computer programs today. So it brings a very hot medium, radio, into the 21st century. So before looking at some more innovations, I want to remind you that the idea of crowdsourcing goes way back. This clip that I'm going to play goes back to 1976, and you may well recognize it. I believe we have it.
Television is not the truth. Television is a goddamn amusement park. Television is a circus, a carnival, a traveling troupe of acrobats, storytellers, dancers, singers, jugglers, sideshow freaks, lion tamers, and football players. We're in the boredom-killing business. So if you want the truth, go to God. Go to your gurus. Go to yourselves. Because that's the only place you're ever going to find any...
Okay, so that was, of course, the movie Network from 1976. It's a very different time in history, but it was looking forward in some interesting ways. So now I'm going to go back onto a sidetrack. I want to talk later about current practices, but first we'll ask the question, could we replace professional journalists entirely? So we're going to do a little experiment. Here are the things that I think journalists do, the main roles that journalists play, and I submit that everything journalists do can be fit into one of these four things, or it's not really that important. And I'll look at each one really quickly. We have reach. Now, it used to be that no news got to anybody until someone put a newspaper on a truck and brought it to them physically. And this is still important, even in the age of the Internet. But there's a lot more in terms of reach. There's bringing content to people's attention, like the placement on the page or the website. There's enabling content to be found. There's syndication, which is something O'Reilly still does a lot of. We take author content and we farm it out to various publications, journals, and websites and so forth to get our reach extended and our authors' reach extended. Archiving is extremely important because when something interesting happens, you want people to be able to find it a few years from now, or maybe even 50 years from now when historians are looking at it. And a reputable site with some financial backing can do that. The next basic idea is quality. There's a lot we can do for quality, just digging up the facts in the first place, ensuring that the information is relevant to the reader. Timeliness. Now, this is something that O'Reilly has a lot to do with. There are a lot of times when I just get on the phone with the author every week and harangue them so they get this thing done. We are the project managers, and it's important to have something when people really need it. Editing is my job. I think it's the most value that a publisher or that anybody can add, and it's something I found that cannot be crowdsourced. We can talk about that later if you like. Now, the presentation and layout, they enhance something on the page, and production values are similar things in terms of audio and video. Let's go on to selection. The choice of the subject, you want to have something that people find useful and important, and putting the right author together with the right subject. Ordering, positioning, and highlighting, as we said before, for reads. Advertising, O'Reilly doesn't do that much of it anymore. It used to be that advertising was critical, and the author was always calling up the publisher and saying, so-and-so got half a page in the New York Review of Books, and I didn't. So this is not actually that important anymore. People are doing a lot more crowdsourcing, and they're not trusting the advertisers as much. So selection is being crowdsourced. And then there's community, an interesting idea here. Let's take, for instance, the AIDS victims in the 1980s. At first, they had trouble organizing because they were dismissed and they were not recognized as a community. On the other hand, when the Boston Globe historically broke the story about the Catholic Church and the sexual abuse going on, they instantly created a community of the silent victims of this. This is not a community they wanted to be part of, but it was very important to them. It gave them support, and it gave them a basis for more action. So a journalist can extend the community's reach. They can promote events and let people know about them, and they can do, once again, archiving. So that is my list of topics, of roles for journalism. Now for the thought experiment. Design a journalistic system based entirely on crowdsourcing and citizen journalism. Now, for the lessons, when we do this, are where we can still use professionals and where the professionals can use crowdsourcing. So let's look at the elements. We have bloggers and other citizen journalists. we have ratings that they give to each other, and we have lots and lots of software. So in this experiment, we're going to start with the content. We need something to talk about. So, of course, we have the bloggers for that. This is an example. I'm looking at that article I mentioned before by our journalist Alex Howard. If you look closely at this, you'll see that it's quite different from what he would probably do in a print publication. He has lots of blue, which of course are links to other places. So he's really thinking about the Internet as a medium. So let's take blogs as fodder for the system. The problem that we face so far is how we can ensure quality. We don't know where this is coming from. You may have more quality than ever before because experts, people who are actually engaging in activities, can talk about these activities. This is extremely powerful. However, you have to worry about broad-mindedness, and you have to worry about far-off topics. If there's something going on in the northern provinces of Pakistan, you may want to have somebody professional to go and check it out. And then with the blogosphere, you usually have no editing. People can make suggestions and can improve things after publication, but when you go to read something new, you get whatever the person put out from the top of his head. So let's take our strawman system and we'll add some crowdsourced filtering and selection. This will hopefully improve quality. So this is an example. This comes from a newspaper website, and you've probably all seen this thing, the most emailed stories of the day. So selection is being crowdsourced here. So we still have problems. Can crowdsourced selectors know what's good? And bad positions can be well argued. You've probably seen politicians who take something that really has no rational basis and they turn it into a platform, they get elected, or perhaps even worse, they don't get elected and then they go on and write a book that we all have to read. Most of our horizons are very limited. We can't really judge whether something is good. Debate is missing or scattered, so it's hard to judge an article in isolation. And some experts produce brilliant analyses, but they are not journalists, so they haven't learned how to angle these things toward the average reader. So I am getting I would like to know whether we're repeating the same slide. Maybe someone can put that in the chat, because what I'm seeing on the screen is the same slide that I had before.
Hi, Andy. It's Yaz here. We'll just take a quick look for you. Okay, there we go. Back to you.
So we're at the next slide now. And what we're going to try to do is crowdsource the reputation of the selectors. We left the content up to the crowd, then we left the selection up to the crowd, and now we'll add ratings. And I believe that each time I press next, I get the same slide over and over. Is this a problem on the user's side, on the audience side? Okay.
No, we can see the slides, Andy.
Thank you. So Slashdot, of course, is the famous site that made ratings a major part of their site. It works for them with their particular type of content, their particular type of readership, very involved. And it's a fairly complex system that people have to learn to use well. So it works. Many people use a system like this. They have ratings as well as comments. And this still leaves a problem, which is particularly common in the political sphere, but may be true in other areas too, where there are what people like to call religious wars. And that is, raters don't always apply the same criteria. For instance, in the political area, some people consider Paul Krugman to be nearly a prophet. Others hate him and listen to the followers of Milton Friedman instead. So evaluators tend to fall into camps for many things. And the people who are rated highly by one camp are rated low by the other camp. So if we don't take these camps into account, we can't use ratings. It's well known that what they call a multi-peaked rating, where there's more than one group that's considered good, a multi-peaked rating is not good for trusting the winners. So here we're going to try something that is just in my mind right now. As far as I know, no one is doing it right now. It's categorizing the system in such a way that you can deal with these multi-peaked ratings. This is a typical one. There are two different groups of experts. Each one has its followers. And so people are polarizing in this case. And what I would like to do to try to solve this problem, this is just a suggestion, get people to listen to opposing points of view. I think we all agree that's a good idea. And the mechanism is to get highly rated leaders to link to the arguments of the opposing leaders, which they ought to be doing anyway if they're responsible. But this would actually be a rating system that mathematically rewards people who link to their opponents. First, you analyze the rating trends to identify the polarized groups, find out what different categories people find into, and find out the leaders, who are just the people who are highly rated within each group. And then if these leaders link to the highly rated arguments of opposing groups, they get extra points. And this may actually lead people to go a little further than usual and to see what is happening in groups of people who they don't usually agree with. So that was my crowdsourcing. I am going to finish up with new attitudes for professional journalists, how you can make a career in a crowdsourced news environment. It's the last of the three main topics in the talk. Let's look back at the roles for a minute. For each role that the publisher or journalist has, the audience also plays a role. For instance, to enhance your reach, the audience has brand recognition. To enhance your quality, they offer feedback. To enhance selection, they make recommendations. And, of course, they are part of the community which the journalist is covering. Let's look at this slide from 1963.
Hi, Nancy. Hi, Ursula. What's a story? Morning glory. What's a tale? Nightingale. Did you hear about Hugo and Kim? Hi, Margie. Hi, Alice. What's a story? Morning glory. What's a word?
So it just gets more embarrassing as it goes along. But, of course, that was Bye Bye Birdie. And it's from 1963, which is almost like the 1950s in terms of what American culture was like. By the way, this also looks forward in an interesting way. In this song, it shows people talking on the telephone while they drive their car. But what I wanted to remind you is that we've always had news before or without journalists. We don't necessarily need journalists for the news. And the attitudes of new journalists comes down to getting closer to your audience. We'll take a look at a few things that I suggest. I'm going to start with some common, just very quickly, common recommendations, because you've probably seen these before. But if you haven't, you can look for them on the Internet and so forth. I'll just give a little introduction to each one. We have the freemium model. This was done, of course, by Chris Anderson of Wired. I believe he invented it. And he suggests that you'll be sustained by only a fraction of your audience. You'll be giving away most of your content. And personalizing the news. I had talked before about making readers into personas, tracking what they do. We have shaping stories. So you not only can present people with particular items that you think they're interested in, you can run items at particular times of the day or particular times of the week. Like some people want world news in the morning and they want entertainment at night. You can shape what you're offering them. Don't let other people aggregate you. Instead, you become the portal. The New York Times is trying to do this with its election app, for instance. Add multimedia. You might have known that I was doing this a lot. Had a lot of graphics, a lot of videos in this talk. Data journalism, this is really critical. The data is going to be very important to you, and you can also get your readers to contribute. So there are sites that are putting out their data, which is great. But I'm not sure if they're going out there and finding out what the readers are doing with the data. They may be able to take these things and turn it into more articles of their own. Next, we have working with citizen journalists. Take their input, allow them to comment, take ideas for stories from them. And one final thing I'll spend a little time on is local content. This may seem kind of a small thing. A lot of people would rather work on the Arab Spring or something world-shaking, but local content is very powerful. This is something that the community organizing movement discovered decades ago. People learn about how to create change by working on local issues. They learn how to speak for themselves so they can take these skills and confidence and go on to larger issues later. So I would take local content as a very serious place for working with your citizen journalists. Here are some useful attitudes. I'll go over each of these in a slide. The first one is staying part of the conversation. There is a seething conversation going on the Internet all around, and you don't want to be left out, which is you could be if you leave everything behind a firewall. So this is why, for instance, the New York Times lets readers read, without subscriptions, you can read 10 articles, I believe. Used to be 20 without paying. And the Boston Globe allows people to deep link to an article so that people can pass around an article to their friends. So loopholes like this allow you to stay part of the conversation. You don't want to stick everything behind a registration site, although certainly you may have to do some of it to get subscriptions. And summaries are a good start, but you could also consider special public articles, and you can ask your interviewees and your sources to participate in these discussions. The next suggestion is not to be proprietary. Many journalists treat their sources like stashes of plutonium. You want to get your scoop, but this is not a good attitude for nowadays. Instead, you should continue. I hope that what I see is also what you see. Journalists are accustomed to acting as intermediaries, but instead the journalists should speak out for themselves, and you can be helping them do that. You can give your sources a voice as well as still performing a journalistic role. And because they can be overwhelmed by people asking for help and asking for their ideas, you can help them to manage their time and manage the people around them. Now, let's have the next slide. Maybe you can help me with this because I seem to be getting the same slide again. Okay, keep them coming back for more. You want your readers not just to read one article, but to come again and again. And my suggestion for this is to consider that the world is just as exciting as a serialized action story, and your story is only one part of a long, ongoing serialization. So we have some journalists putting up living news stories. This means that along with their most recent article, they put links to earlier articles that provide some context and background. Well, that's fine, but I suggest that you also highlight what's uncertain, what might happen next, highlight the doubts and ambiguities, and that will make readers interested in finding out more next time. And my final suggestion is finding appropriate partners. You have to raise your eyes beyond your own organization and look for big opportunities that you can find by working with other organizations. So there are educational organizations, social policy institutions. They share many of your goals. And sponsored news is one way to make use of them, but that's just sort of a one-way street. Really, you can play complementary roles. An educational site may have a course that covers in a deep way the things that you are covering on a day-to-day basis. So they can really work with you. These form a continuum of public involvement. Now, as my parting inspiration, I want to suggest that this is a great time to be involved in journalism. Don't be afraid. It's like having Gutenberg, the invention of radio broadcasting, and the introduction of color photography all at once. And I'm going to end with one more video which comes straight from the master. Listen quickly.
Idea of how to run a newspaper?
I don't know how to run a newspaper, Mr. Thatcher.
So, thank you very much. I did not notice any questions, but I am open for questions now.
Great. Andy, thank you for an outstanding webcast. And we do actually have several questions that came in. I will read them to you, and we'll start with Philip. Philip asks, is the problem the journalists in traditional news sources or the entire editor hierarchy?
Is the problem, with sources or with the entire hierarchy?
Right. Is the problem the journalists in the traditional news sources or the entire editor hierarchy?
Well, I'm not sure. I guess you could blame the editors, but you could also blame the business staff. So there has been a lot of talk about this. I don't claim to be an expert because even though I've done a fair amount of journalism, I'm not working in one of these institutions. And maybe Alex Howard would be a better person for this. But certainly the whole institution has to change. They have to rethink everything from the bottom up. They have to rethink the relationship between advertising and their content. So it certainly goes beyond an individual journalist. Journalists can certainly do a lot to improve what they are doing nowadays if they and the editors understand more about big data, which of course is an O'Reilly topic and a big computing topic. If they understand the uses of data, the risks of analyzing data, then they can put out stories that go deeper and use more information. So I think that's about all I can say on that. Let's try another question.
Sure. Our next one is from Wendy, and Wendy asks, could you discuss the difference between news event crowdsourcing like eyewitness reports and using collective intelligence in news gathering / fact-checking?
Quite interesting. Yes. Well, certainly sometimes people don't do enough fact-checking when the story goes up, and then they get a comment saying, you missed this. It's happened to me. So one of the nice things about the Internet is that things can be updated instantly and they can be updated over time. So this can go on after the story is done. I would say one useful use of crowdsourcing, which sort of went by very quickly, is not only to get reports, not only to interview people about their impressions, but to actually help you figure out what has to be covered. And this is, of course, part of any deep journalistic enterprise. But you can use your citizen journalist to say, this is important to our community. We really care about, say, a construction that's going up on this street, or we care about the construction for these particular reasons, not for the reasons you've given us. So, yes, there is a lot more to crowdsourcing than just collecting stories or collecting opinions from people. I think we can try another question.
Great, thank you. We have a question from James. James asks, how do you tone down the audience once it gets to name-calling and inflammatory insults? Or do you just remove their comments or blog posts?
I very rarely remove a blog post, and certainly I've been on forums where the rancor destroys the forum, where people get fed up either because there's just such a volume of it or because they don't want to read this. They just don't want negativity all day. So it can be destructive. Ratings can possibly help. I think it's good for someone to come in once in a while, and probably you've been on forums where someone did this. They came in and said, hey, folks, let's try to keep a proper attitude here. And perhaps once in a while you can remove a really egregious posting to show that you mean business. But I think with crowdsourcing, you sort of lose control. The person in the center doesn't always have control over what goes on, and the people there have to police themselves and police each other to some extent. So let's have another question.
Okay, our next question is from Philip, and Philip says, would you consider social sites like Facebook and Pinterest crowdsourced news platforms? How do you protect crowdsourced news sites from spamming?
Okay. I guess two questions. I certainly do consider Facebook and platforms like that to be news platforms. People do get their news, although a recent study, I think it was the Pew Research Center, a recent study said that there are fewer people getting their news from something like Facebook than you would expect. More people are going to aggregators of other types or going directly to the news sources. But a small and perhaps growing number of people are getting a lot of their news by reading what their friends read and seeing what their friends post. And another phenomenon, very important, is that someone may post a link to an article and have a lot of comments on Facebook or Google Plus or wherever. There are some very interesting conversations that go on these social sites. They go on for 50, 60 more messages about an article that was posted. If you go back to the article itself, there might not be that many comments on it. which is too bad. It would be really great to have people go back to the original article and put the comments there, but apparently they feel more comfortable with their little community on the social networking site. And I believe there was one case where there was an article that really wasn't very good. It wasn't very well argued. And I think the only reason it got much attention is that somebody highlighted it on his site, and he was a well-known person in the field, and a lot of people responded to that. And as for, let's see, we were trying to protect them from spam. Well, if there was an easy solution for that, it would have been found long ago. I suppose we could extend some of the same techniques to comments that we use for mail filtering, and I do believe some sites do filter out comments, but spam is going to be with us for a long time. It's always a race between the experts developing the filters and the experts who are working for the spammers. So it's not an easy problem, and I've removed a number of comments. There's one thing I put up years ago that nobody looks at anymore, but spammers put stuff up there, and I feel it's my responsibility to take it down manually. And any more questions?
Okay, looks like we have 2 more questions, and we'll just let our audience know. Folks, if you do have any questions for Andy, please type them into the group chat. Send them in while he is still with us. Okay, we have Philip. Philip would like to know, what is the URL for Fuego?
Oh, well, I suppose someone should post that later. I know the Nieman Foundation started it, so if you do a web search, you could try entering Nieman with 2 N's, Nieman Foundation and Fuego, or later on maybe somebody could post something to the website with the URLs.
Okay. And then our final one is KS, like Dispute Finder, has ended. Is that correct?
Sorry, what was that? I think it might be something that I haven't been following.
Okay, I'm going to try to repeat it here from Philip. Philip, if I'm not getting it right, I apologize. Let me know what exactly you're saying. He states, KS, like Dispute Finder, is ended, with a question mark.
I don't think I know that particular project, so if you got it right, then I just have to pass. I'm sorry. Okay. Somebody finally got me.
That's all the questions I see coming in. Oh, Philip says, oh, no, never mind. Okay, Andy, as we wrap up here, did you want to leave our attendees today with any additional insight?
Well, I gave my parting thing. I guess the only thing I'll say is that in publishing we're facing a lot of the same things. Journalism is sort of our sister industry, and we're watching with some trepidation as it has its cutbacks and so forth. But it's also a very exciting time. O'Reilly is not just hunkering down. We are doing all kinds of new things. We're trying to move in many directions at once. We're trying to be entrepreneurial while we're still maintaining our cash cows. So journalists have to learn to do this too.